I have been looking forward to this conversation all day. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. He was nice enough to come back on the show for a few minutes to discuss the deal that was, well, not signed, but the deal that was negotiated between Russia and the U.S. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay?
Tomorrow, I'm alive. Thanks for having me on the show. It's always an honor and a pleasure to not see you.
Fair enough. I accept that. And I thank you for joining me when it's an honor and pleasure not to see you. I brought you on because I wanted to just get details on the deal that seemingly has been worked out. It seems well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Seems to be worked out. It seems they're trying to revive the grain deal. Lavrov and China One pointed out very clearly, look, we don't trust anybody at this point. We've been burned so many times. We need concrete details to be worked out before this comes into play, including sanction relief that allows our agricultural products to go through, the transactions to go through cheaper, to be re-added back to the SWIFT system in the context of these agricultural products. Am I getting this right so far? Also, this notion of not attacking ships on the Black Sea, which apparently has been violated already by Ukraine as they were flying drones over the Black Sea, as reported by Sky News. Have I said anything incorrect? Have I gotten this?
No. I think you got some of the general outlines correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the U.S. So what came out of this is the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine both have general agreement statements that they made, right? However, there is no new ceasefire in place, right? That we know of, right? Because nothing has been announced that this came into effect on this day. And the Russian side put out considerably more details. It has to, all three sides, if you will, even though the majority of these negotiations obviously did not involve the Kiev regime in Ukraine at all. Right. They didn't mention any of this. The U.S. mentioned it a bit, and Russia went into considerably more detail, although even with that, there are a lot of questions.
Yes.
And basically, this was something that is, in effect, shall we say, initialed by the two respective expert groups, right, that were meeting in Saudi Arabia. But then this will be taken back to their leaders, because particularly according to the Russian side, right, even the provisions about the non-use of force on the Black Sea, etc., only come into force after certain things. And these are Russia's conditions. And that involves lifting Russian sanctions from Roslholzbank, which is an agricultural bank in Russia, and other financial organizations involved in ensuring operations on international trade in food products, including fish products, and fertilizers, connecting them to SWIFT, opening the necessary correspondent accounts, lifting restrictions on trade finance transactions. I don't know exactly what that means. That sounds rather all encompassing, and sounds like it could be on just the Black Sea, right? Also, lifting sanctions restrictions on companies producing and exporting food and fertilizers, as well as lifting restrictions on the work of insurance companies with food cargo and fertilizers, lifting restrictions on servicing ships in ports, and sanctions against ships under the Russian flag involved in the trade of food products, lifting restrictions on the supply of agricultural machinery to the Russian Federation, as well as other goods used in the production of food. Right, so they're asking for quite substantial sanctions relief in order to pass this bill, right? And some of the things, and particularly those involving the U.S. halting its measures to prevent Russia from gaining insurance from Western firms, I guess, in particular. Russia, of course, has their own firms and so forth, but the U.S. has been pursuing secondary sanctions against Russian shipping, what it calls Russia's shadow fleet, because it doesn't have control over them because they're not under Western insurance. So Russia's asking for a whole lot of financial, trade, shipping, and port sanctions to be removed. And we've heard from Trump. He made an aside when asked questions by journalists that he was looking into relieving sanctions on Russia to get the Black Sea Initiative through. So they're studying what the Russian conditions are. And that's where we are right now. So it's not like anything has been agreed on in a Black Sea deal. Ceasefire has gone into effect, but there obviously was substantial technical details worked out during those 12 hours. They were very mum, right? I don't know anyone who said, "Oh, they almost got something," right? That wasn't what anyone got. That they had they were very tight-lipped. Some of the words we heard were difficult but useful, and the American side saying that, well, we don't actually have to have a document or details coming out as long as we're talking to each other, right? So no one with those signals, said, "Oh my God, they've almost got." But then they released this afterwards. Now the Russians, some Russian officials have come forward and said that the reason there was no joint communique immediately following or press statement immediately following the expert group's meeting is because the Kiev regime refused, that they didn't agree to any of this, basically. And it has to be said that there's still so many. I mean, even if all these sanctions were removed to Russia's satisfaction, then there's this question. One of the provisions, of course, is the non-use of commercial vehicles for military purposes.
Right there.
Yeah.
No, please continue. I was just saying that was going to be a sticking point because beforehand, Ukraine was effectively shipping weapons.
So what the Ukraine has been doing is sending ships right out with grain, and when they come back in, they're carrying weapons. Right, this was happening, and the U.S. was obviously in on this, as well as the European Union. Turkey was supposed to be handling the inspections, but obviously, I mean, come on, it's Erdogan. And at the end of the day, they're a NATO country. So that's one of the main reasons that Russia pulled out of the original grain deal, the original Black Sea Initiative, is because of the weapons supply to Ukraine. And so this supposedly forbids it. But nothing was mentioned by anyone on how this would be monitored or enforced. Who is going to check commercial ships coming into Ukraine to make sure that they're not carrying weapons or munitions, or something involved in, military production? There's none of that specified. No, not about who would do it, about how it would be done, because obviously Russia's not going to trust Turkey to do it anymore. And it's hard to see how anyone other than the Russian Navy would be capable of doing that, because the Montreux Convention regulating traffic in and out of the Black Sea by the Turkish-controlled Dardanelles Straits prohibits, it limits the amount of foreign ships from non-littoral states. You're allowed one ship, into the Black Sea. So obviously it can't be, say, the United States, not that Russia would trust the United States in this particular regard either. So I have to say that the hurdles towards this, both on the sanctions relief on the U.S. side and the implementation that would be necessary, right? Romania and Bulgaria were already sounding all kind of alarms that they didn't want the status quo changed, precisely because they didn't want Russian ships off their coasts stopping, because this is what Ukraine does, right? The Ukraine in the West, their ships skirt the NATO coasts all the way up to the Dnieper River and then duck into Odessa, right? I mean, that is what has been going on. And so that would, using a lot of their, territorial limits, the waters right off their coast to do this under, some degree of protection. So does that mean that Russia is going to be stopping commercial shipping that could potentially be carrying munitions to Ukraine right off of Romania and Bulgaria's coasts?
It would have to.
There's
no other option.
I don't see that's going to happen.
But there's no other option. I mean,
there is the option that this is a dead fish, that there's no hope of this ever being approved, right? And Russia's conditions, like their conditions for the proposal for a general ceasefire, are simply supposed to highlight, how impossible this really is, short of a complete settlement of the conflict.
Mark, I don't.
Sorry.
It doesn't have to be impossible. I guess. Look, the sanctions were put on by the United States, correct?
Well,
so the US
there is another possibility. There is a third party that could be involved in inspecting those ships. If the Martian Navy, right, from the Expanse, could come down and inspect those ships, that might be agreeable to both sides.
With their power armor, just ready to take somebody's head off. I guess my thing is, the U.S. put the sanctions on. I know Europe has their own thing.
Yeah.
Why can't the U.S. remove those sanctions in the way that they put them on, or for that matter,
Congress, because a lot of this will almost certainly have to go through Congress, right? And Trump does not have, almost certainly does not have the votes to remove these sanctions through Congress.
Even the SWIFT system, I didn't think that went through Congress.
I'm gonna plead ignorant on the detail specifically of the SWIFT system. That may not be involved in Congress, right? But I'm almost certain that at least some of that must be removed by Congress, right? I don't know the specific details. I'm not into the sanctions economic nitty-gritty of that. I imagine that there will be reporting on that in the coming days. But already the Washington Post is coming out with saying that this is humiliating for Trump, right? They're basically saying that Russia is asking for too much and that the U.S. should not agree to it, right? And so that's almost certainly the narrative. This is the initial assessment, because there's still a little bit of shock about the way that this came out. So it's not being too widely reported yet. Also, it's very technical and it's way above the heads of your average, John Q. public,
it's
reading
the Washington Post. Of course, the Washington Post is going to say that. Russia could have came out and said, look, we just want a birthday cake for Putin on his birthday once a year. And they were like, oh my God, I can't believe they're asking for that. Meaning anything that the Russians were going to ask for, a Western media that is berated, attacked, has not reported this honestly, was going to report it in that way. So
sure, but it's also a good bellwether about how the Democrats and the neocons in Congress are going to react to it.
I guess my feeling is, who cares what they think? I mean,
because you can't remove almost certainly at least some of these sanctions without Congress agreeing to it, and which is always, Putin has pointed this out going back years now as one of the primary reasons that, we can expect sanctions to last for decades.
I guess I get the sense, and I could be wrong, that Donald Trump has been able to bend these people into shape. Democrats will scream and yell. He has no power over them. From the standpoint of Republicans, they have not complained once about what Trump has been doing in regards to these negotiations, despite the fact that they completely disagree with Donald Trump on the negotiations.
they've rolled over and played dead through so far, particularly on his
Yes.
nominations. And I will acknowledge surprise with that and everything, but this is going to require a higher degree of support from Congress to remove these sanctions, right? We're not looking at a 51-50. We're looking at a 2/3 majority.
So do you think that Russia effectively put out a poison pill? We want to keep the war going. We believe the war is in our best interest. We want to.
I don't know. I mean, maybe technically it's a poison pill, but it's actually also what they would require to make it worth their while to agree to this ceasefire.
See,
They're in the driver's seat. They're in the driver's seat, right?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I did assume that any negotiation was going to go beyond the war because the U.S. has lost the war. And so Donald Trump had to sweeten it with something other than just details on the ground.
U.S. intelligence just came out with an assessment of the conflict today. It was released to the public that even with continued or increased U.S. and Western assistance to Ukraine, that Russia has the upper hand and that is not going to change, which is the first time that that's really been admitted at that level, that frankly.
Give me your overall assessment of all of this. What time is it? Give me your overall assessment of this. I mean, look, I don't think
it hasn't changed much. First of all, it has to be noted that the Russian Ministry of Defense has noted that Ukraine has violated the ceasefire on energy infrastructure again. They've basically done it every day, right? Now, there is evidently some disagreement about when it actually came into effect and when Ukraine agreed to it or not. But certainly in the last 24 hours, right? That was what everyone has agreed to. And they've attacked Russian energy infrastructure again in the last 24 hours. So why Russia is going through the motions of this to continue to signal to Trump how rational, how reasonable they are, and how irrational and unreasonable Ukraine is, right? Russia does not want to be the one blamed for the failure of Trump's drive for peace. Both sides don't want peace, at least as it exists right now. When we're talking the Kiev regime and Russia, neither one wants peace, right? Neither one is satisfied. Neither one has met their war aims. Neither either side has admitted surrender and agreed to the conditions. So, but they also, the U.S. is still such a heavy player involved in this that both sides, all with Trump seemingly desperate, for having invested so much unwisely political capital in announcing that he was going to end this conflict. Russia doesn't want to, make him look bad, right? Because they hope that even if a settlement in Ukraine fails or is not a possibility at all, that at least bilateral relations over the next 4 years with the U.S. can approve, let's say, on a separate, only slightly overlapping track. I think Russia is going through the motions at this point. They don't believe that anything is really going to come of this because the Americans seem completely oblivious on a diplomatic level of what is required for ceasefires, whether we're talking in the Black Sea or general ceasefires or even energy infrastructure. How do we monitor that Ukraine is bombing Russian energy infrastructure? And Ukraine says, no, we're not. And if it was bombed, it was the Russians bombing themselves again, right? Okay, so what happens then? Right? Because that's happened every day so far. And Russia is still not attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure and saying to Trump, look, we're still playing ball. And Russia can go through the next 30 days suffering this. And, at the end, it's still not going to change anything because a ceasefire and according at least to the American view of how a ceasefire would lead to more substantial peace negotiations is simply not going to work. Russia is, and meanwhile, within Russia, I have to say, there is a great deal of simmering resentment that the Kiev regime is still hitting Russia, violating a ceasefire that Russia didn't need and the Russian military didn't want in the first place, and that Putin appears to just be smiling and taking it. They don't like that. They say, why are we doing this? We're winning. We're beating not just the Kiev regime. We've beaten the U.S. and NATO, right? We can continue to do this. Why are we going through this dog and pony show? Now, Putin has a diplomatic plan, but that being said, Putin has had lots of diplomatic plans since 2014, and not all of them have worked out that well.
So you think this is pointless?
I think this is absolutely pointless. I mean, maybe it keeps China and India happy. I mean, that's that Russia is at least going through the motions, right? That's not nothing, right?
But I think there's value in reestablishing a relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because I live here.
In 4 years, there's every possibility that there could be another Joe Biden in office. I think that there's very little point in Russia jumping through hurdles to try to restore relations with a country that has killed effectively
hundreds of
thousands of Russians,
yeah,
which is the United States, because ultimately they're responsible.
That 1,000% true. I totally get it. If something can be done to stop all of these people from being killed, I want it to be done. I agree with you that Putin just effectively said, this is what we want. This is what we need.
And in the end, I think that regardless of what is agreed to tomorrow and how long it lasts, right, that until this regime is removed in Kiev, that people in Ukraine and Russia will ultimately continue to die, right? And there is always the possibility that if it, let's say it goes into abatement now, there's some kind of magical ceasefire or peace settlement that is agreed to, and the war is ignited in 4 years again when another U.S. president is in office and the Europeans have rearmed, then there's every possibility that big blow up to Russia and between Russia and NATO directly could that specter could come back. So
let me ask you this last question. What about this notion of Russia extending the negotiations? Basically, we're going to extend this because we're winning. We want to keep going on the battlefield until we get to a certain point, and then we'll stop. And we're willing to negotiate. And ideally, at that point, Ukraine will be weak enough where they would be willing to say, okay, we will also negotiate it this way. Meaning, all of this is being done purely for the sake of continuing the war up until the point where they're ready to call it a day. They've gotten everything that they wanted. They've gotten all the land that they wanted. They negotiated while they were continuing to do this. Like, what do you think of that as a play? Meaning, look, they know they're not going anywhere. They know the ask is going to be too much in the short term. But at a certain point, that ask is going to be, let's say, more legit based upon the amount of land that they've taken. Sure. And that Europe doesn't want them to go to the Polish border. Trump doesn't want them at the Polish border. I would imagine Ukraine doesn't want all of Ukraine to be taken. Like, meaning maybe there's a sweet spot where, okay, everybody calls it a day.
Yeah, sure. When the Kiev regime is ready for total surrender, but I don't know if that day certainly not near, and they may decide to fight to the end. I mean, if they're removed from Kiev, who says they don't set up shop in Lvov? And if they're driven out of Lvov, who's to say they don't continue a guerrilla war out of Poland? Right? Yeah. Unfortunately, these people are ideological. And Russian hatred is the primary component of that ideology. Zelensky has a painting of a burning Kremlin right outside his office, right? And of Ukraine, right? So, and he says, this is where I live. this is victory, right? I mean, he's not talking peace, right? So how can you deal with these people, right? I think, and is there validity to the idea that Russia is needlessly dragging out the diplomacy? No, I don't think it is needlessly. I think Russia is simply going to go through the motions of everything they need to make this worth their while and to get some scrap of legal legitimacy. You know, they're you want to talk a ceasefire? Okay, let's show what would be necessary, a minimum of what would be necessary for a functioning ceasefire that would satisfy us, right? And I don't think that's necessary needlessly, but there's certainly no condition that while Russia goes through this without any hope, I think, of achieving anything out of it, they're going to continue on the battlefield. And again, there's multiple reasons for that. One is to continue to take territory and attrit the Kiev regime military on the ground, always hoping that at some point, hope against hope, that the Kiev regime crumbles in Kiev, right? And that ends this, quicker than it would be otherwise. But at the same time, they also have their eyes on diplomatic contacts with countries like India and Brazil, that it wants to maintain on their side, right? At least, diplomatically, economically, for trade while this is going on. So there's multiple reasons, right, why Russia would go through this. And again, I think they genuinely see at least a temporary window to bilaterally improve relations with the U.S. And they seem to think that there's some advantage in pursuing that. I'm very skeptical of that myself, because everything is in the long run, right? Yeah. We're dealing with a man who signed a ceasefire or brokered a ceasefire with Hamas, then stuffed Israel full of weapons and 2,000-pound bombs, and then completely greenlit, new bombings on Gaza. A man who says, I care about the people, the beautiful people, and now is killing hundreds of civilians, including children in Yemen, with U.S. bombing of Yemen, calling them barbarians and that they'll be annihilated. He's a man who 1 week called Zelensky a dictator, and then the next week said, oh, did I say that? It doesn't sound like something I would say. So,
and a man who called for a ceasefire for 30 days and then blew it off immediately. And not blew it off, but Ukraine has now violated the ceasefire, even on the Black Sea and at the energy grids.
Has the U.S. said anything in public about that? Have they even said anything in private to Ukraine?
They have not.
I don't know. The last I don't know about, but they certainly haven't said anything publicly. And if they've said anything privately, it hasn't had any effect.
Well, they need to say something public. I mean, I agree with you. Unfortunately, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Mark,
sorry, my skepticism still overrides. There was more substantial details discussed. There is a plan being presented back to Trump of what Russia could potentially agree to. And the ball's back in Trump's court.
Let me ask you this. Do you think those demands are maximalist? Like, do you think that ultimately, okay, they're putting out these demands, but they'll accept less?
After everything that has been done to Russia, by the U.S. and by the West, absolutely, I do not think that these demands are maximalist. I think that Dmitry Medvedev has put out some good maximalist demands, right, involving the dissolution of Ukraine, of the Kiev regime in Ukraine and Ukraine as a state. That is good maximalist goals that I would fully support after everything that has happened for the Russia. Russia has won this war, right? Whatever they say. They have inflicted a strategic defeat on the United States and NATO that the political damage to NATO, I don't think NATO's going to fall apart, but it is institutionally and reputationally damaged, right? And Russia has suffered enough in blood and treasure that they should get everything out of this they can, and they should do it in as substantial and overbearing a way as possible for deterrent value, so that the US and Europe will hesitate before coming back for round 2 in 5 years or 10 years.
Agreed. You have my full agreement on that one, Mark. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can also follow Mark on his YouTube channel at Real Politics with Mark Sleboda. Mark, at Facebook, at facebook.com/Gramsci. Is there anywhere else that people can find you, Mark?
Yeah. I mean, Facebook if you're like my grandparents or something like that. But for everyone else, Substack and Telegram at The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda.
There it is. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it, man. Be safe.
Thanks for having me again.
You have a good one. All right. Deeply appreciate Mark for coming on. He didn't have to come on. Usually I try to get him at least once a week. I don't like to bug people too much. So that's why you typically see people once a week. Shout out to him for it. He didn't have to do it. He came on to give an explanation of what was going on. Deeply appreciate him. Look, I appreciate all my guests. Mark is special to me. He tends to be more right. He tends to be more straightforward. And I guess for my take, he tends to be more honest when he talks about this stuff. So